When it comes to emulation devices, there are few companies that have a higher standing in the industry than Anbernic. I've had an Anbernic handheld for a couple of years, but I just got a new one in the mail. We're going to unbox it today, and we're going to put it through its paces to see how it performs. Today, we're reviewing the Anbernic RG 353P. All right, so we have here the Anbernic RG 353P handheld emulation machine. We're going to get this guy unboxed, find out what's inside, see how it performs, and take a look at it. I'm really excited about this one. Love Anbernic stuff, and this one has been on my wish list for a little while, so I'm hoping this performs the way I expect it to. So as we start off, as always from Anbernic, really, really solid packaging, and I will show you what I mean when I get it out of the bag. One of the things that they ship it with is this foam cover, so it's nice and safe. It's not going to get damaged in transport. Now you'll see here, this is a dual analog machine. I opted for the Super Nintendo colors with the light purples and grays. 2 analog sticks, a D-pad. We've got an HDMI out, which I'm really excited about, a micro HDMI out. You have your USB-C charging, reset R1, R2, and then your 2 SD card options with a headphone pairing as well. And back here, I don't know, these might be touchpads. This was something that, like I said, I was really excited about. And yeah, let's see what else is in the box. So we get a USB-C cable, which is always welcome. We have our user manual, our cleaning cloths, a screen protector, which is super appreciated, and then a secondary 64 gigabyte SD card. So looking at the instruction manual, take a look. It's in a book, a reading rainbow. Alright, yeah, so this is just a basic instruction manual, functions of what it has. These are the different things there. Looks like the stuff on the back was not a touchpad so much as it was just me having wishful thinking, but let's get this turned on, let's get it charged up, and let's see how it performs. So to start things off, I think we're going all the way back, and we're going to go to Generation 2 with the Atari 2600. We're going to start at the low end of things with the things that are easy to emulate and work our way up. But starting with the 2600, like I mentioned, we're starting with Pitfall. Pitfall is one of my favorite platformers, and I had a terrible run on this, but there was no problems encountered as we would expect for a 2600 title, right? Like, it ran great, sounded great, looked great. I then played Plaque Attack, which I hadn't played since I was a kid, and it's just as much fun as I remember. You are playing Space Invaders with teeth and burgers and fries, and I mean, it works fantastically. It looks good and plays good. It's got those signature 2600 sounds, and I think that's really all you can ask for. And then finally, I played something I'd never played before, and that was the 2600 version of Popeye, and wow, that's a rough one. That's a rough version of Popeye, but I mean, it still gets everything across. It looks okay. I mean, it's definitely not as nice as the NES version, but it looks all right. It looks okay, and the sound is okay, and it plays, it's rough. It's not a great gameplay experience, but it emulates beautifully, which is what you would hope for something on the 2600. But let's move on now to the 8-bit generation with the Famicom and the NES. Up first on the Famicom, we have a licensed game starring one of my favorite anime characters, and it's Lupin Sansei Pandora no Isan. This is based on the Castle of Cagliostro movie, which was done by Miyazaki, and it is absolutely magnificent. The game, less so. It is definitely not as well-rounded as the Castle of Cagliostro, but it's really fun, although it does have a fairly steep learning curve. Like, having to figure out that you had to be running downhill to be able to increase your jump distance wasn't something I expected and something I had a little bit of trouble with, as you've seen me dying repeatedly here, but the game itself is really fun, and honestly, for a Famicom game that's licensed, it's pretty faithful to what it should be. Up next on the Famicom, though, we have another licensed game, and that is Star Wars by Namco, and this game is just absolutely wackadoo. Like, do you remember the birds on Tatooine that attacked Luke, or when Darth Vader turned into a scorpion? Yeah, I don't remember that from the movies either, but this game is great. It's a lot of fun. It's incredibly challenging. Like, this is very much NES hard, but boy howdy is it a lot of fun. Definitely worth checking out, and the silver cartridge that it ships on with physical hardware is amazing. But talking about emulation, both of these games run absolutely perfectly, 0 issues encountered. Now let's hop over to the NES with 2 of my favorite games. This is one of those games that I really wish I had held on to when I was a kid, and that is Power Blade. This was one of my favorite games when I was younger. I remember seeing an ad for this, or at least a feature for it, in Nintendo Power, and just thinking it was the coolest thing ever because back in the 80s we loved boomerangs. I don't know why. I think it was all because of Crocodile Dundee, but boomerangs were super cool to me, and I loved the fact that there was a video game starring a cool character using a boomerang as a weapon, and the game itself is fantastic. And I chose this one because I think it's a really excellent action platformer, and there's a lot of quick-moving stuff in the game and a lot of screen transitions. And I was trying to kind of trip up the emulator a little bit, but I didn't actually run into anything. Now, the second game I played on the NES was Jackal. And if you've never played Jackal, first off, shame on you. Second of all, shame on you. What the hell are you doing? Play the game. It's so good. One of the best multiplayer games on the NES, but also really fun single player. Now, that is, I think, one of the weaknesses of the Anbernic, is that it is decidedly a single player experience, but if you have a chance to play this, it's well worth your time because it is one of the best run-and-gun shooters on the NES. It's something that is just truly a joy to experience, and it's fun. It's a classic Konami gaming experience and something that I really think a lot of people need to play. Now, I chose this one not because I thought it would be challenging for the emulator, but honestly, just because I wanted to play it because I think it's really fun, and it plays flawlessly. One of the things I wanted to point out about the Anbernic as well is that it actually has an HDMI out. Using a micro HDMI cable to a regular HDMI out, I was able to hook this up to my capture card and get this footage captured off my television using the Anbernic as a controller. And that is like one of the biggest selling points to me, is being able to use this not only handheld, but actually being able to use it on a television as well. And I think that is one of the best features about it, and something that I don't think can be understated, because having all of these games in my pocket is great, but being able to hook them up to a TV as well is fantastic. Been showing Nintendo a lot of love here with 2 Nintendo consoles in a row, but let's hop over to that generation's Sega console, and that was the Sega Master System. Now, the Master System was not something I owned when I was growing up. It was something I went over to my friend Peter's house to play, and he had a ton of cool games. He had family over in Europe that used to send him stuff, which is how I got to play this game for the first time, The Lucky Dime Caper, starring Donald Duck. This game is absolutely incredible, and if you look at some of these classic Master System games, you realize exactly how strong of a console this was, and some of the just absolutely amazing abilities that Sega had for things like simple animations and amazing, I'm using amazing a lot, wonderful shading and color work that they had on all of their sprites. Lucky Dime Caper is just bonkers good. Like, this is one of my favorite games, period. Not just on the Master System, just flat out. It is a ton of fun to play, classic Disney gameplay, and one of the best Sega-made Disney games ever. Up next, we're going to hop over to Capcom, and that is with Ghouls and Ghosts on the Sega Master System. And this one's a little interesting because it doesn't play anything like the NES one, doesn't play anything like the arcade version. It's decidedly its own thing while still paying kind of reverence to that original arcade release. And it's hard because it's Ghosts and Goblins, and it makes you want to pull your hair out. But that's okay, because it's still a really fun experience, and it's significantly better than the NES version. I hate the NES version of Ghosts and Goblins, but this one's actually really fun. You should try this one out if you haven't had a chance to yet. Now, Sega Master System emulation is pretty easy. It's pretty standard. It's been done for years, and the Anbernic is handling it flawlessly. There hasn't been an issue encountered that I've seen with anything I've played. I only captured footage for these 2, but I played a few other games as well. But I think it's handling this really well. Now, of course, it isn't only going to be doing home consoles, it also does handheld. So let's hop over to Nintendo's handheld from the era, the Game Boy. So first thing to point out on this is you can change the presentation of how the Game Boy screen looks like, but I was feeling a little creamed spinach today, so I stuck with the green layout. And up first, we're playing Kid Dracula from Konami, which is related to the Castlevania series, but decidedly not a Castlevania game. I don't know if this is Dracula's son or if this is just young Dracula before he became kind of a dick to the Belmont family, but I don't know. It's a fun game. I enjoy it. And after that, we played Mega Man 3, and the Mega Man Game Boy games are spectacular and something I have never really put a lot of time into. My friend John over at Biddy Kong's Quest loves these games and swears by them and thinks they're fantastic. He just completed his collection on these recently, actually. And I wanted to give it a shot, and this plays so true to life and so true to what a Mega Man game should play like, just on a significantly condensed screen size. And the emulation on this, as you'd expect for the Game Boy, is flawless. It looks fantastic, sounds great, and plays perfectly. Up next, we're going to hop over to a Sega handheld, and that is the Game Gear. always wanted a Game Gear when I was younger. I thought it looked really cool, but when I found out that it ate batteries kind of like I was eating Cheetos at the time, it really didn't seem like a good idea. So I haven't played a whole lot of Game Gear games. So getting onto this and playing this on the emulator, I was kind of sticking to things that I'm familiar with so I could see how they would play in comparison to what I know they play like. First up was Bubble Bobble, and as much as I love Bubble Bobble, Game Gear version kind of sucks. Not a fault of the emulation by any stretch of the imagination, but the Game Gear version, the music just is on a constant loop, so you kind of get like the same 10 seconds of the song over and over and over again. And as much as I love the Bubble Bobble music, the only time you really want to hear it that often is when it's going to transition to other music. You don't want to hear the same and then it repeats again. It's kind of maddening. After that, though, I played Pac-Man, and Pac-Man is magnificent, as you would expect. I mean, it's been around forever. It should run on the Game Gear, and it runs perfectly on the Anbernic. It's a lot of fun. It looks and plays just like the arcade version, which is what you'd want, and it's kind of all you need. I do like that this is one of the scrolling screen versions, so it's not just something where it's trying to force-feed everything onto a very small screen. Actually move around. It works really well. This is spectacular. We're going to hop now from the Game Gear onto the 16-bit Sega console. 3 of them, in fact, in a row. We're doing Genesis, 32X, and the Sega CD. Of course, I'm starting the Genesis with NHL 94. It is one of my all-time favorite games. I gotta have a little bit of sports action in these videos, you know that. This is just such a spectacular title, and it is flawless on the Anbernic. It's just like playing it on my Genesis. This is like popping my copy of NHL 94 into my Genesis and sitting down in front of my television. There is no issue here. It is perfect. It feels right. Like, even the speed and the timing, this feels exactly like NHL 94. I've done some other emulation devices playing NHL 94, and I'm so kind of intimately knowledgeable about this game that I can tell when it's a little bit off because I've played thousands upon thousands of hours of it, and this is just spot on, runs perfectly. Next up, I hopped over to Streets of Rage 2 because, honestly, if you're going to play a beat-em-up, you might as well play one of the best of all time, right? And it's just magnificent. I love it. Looks great. The sprites are fantastic. The gameplay is spot on. There's no issues with the sound. Everything is running exactly the way it should. Super happy about that. Really love the way this is working, but I kind of expected the Genesis to play perfectly. 32X was a different story. Let's see how that one did. I've had some nightmares doing 32X emulation. I've had some significant problems with it in the past. So I fully anticipated this to be an absolute just trash fire. Just awful experience altogether, and it wasn't. I just kind of tossed the ROMs onto the machine, I booted it up, it ran, and it played beautifully. Starting off with one of the best first-person shooters of all time, Doom. And I have this on my 32X. I have the original cartridge, and this is just spot on perfect. It sounds amazing, and it looks great. I didn't expect that. I expected there to be some tearing. I expected there to be some issues because, like I said, I've had some emulation issues with 32X stuff in the past, and this has just been flawless. But the real test I wanted to put it through was with Virtua Racing, because Virtua Racing frequently breaks down on emulation machines and just does not run. And this is perfect. Amazing sound, great controls, perfect look, no issues with it at all, no tearing or anything like that. I was so impressed and so happy with how this played. It was just a blast to sit down and play it. I actually played it for about 20 minutes yesterday and just had a ton of fun doing it because, I mean, hey, it's Virtua Racing. Why wouldn't you? Up next, we're hopping over to the Sega CD, and this is another one that I expected to kind of fail based on my previous experiences with the 32X, but I was pleasantly surprised. Let's take a look.
But be careful not to hit any of the living creatures.
Just drive, Tenrak! Leave the shooting to me!
When it comes to the Sega CD, for emulation, I haven't had a whole lot of trouble emulating stuff in the past because the games are playing fine, but where the problem has kind of crept up is with the sound. Sega CD sound is amazing, but emulation for some reason just kind of gets it a little chunky and doesn't make it sound great, but I was really, really surprised with how well the Anbernic handled it. Up first was Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, which, if you don't know anything about Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, I encourage you to hop over to Toy Galaxy, take a look at their video on the history of Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, because it's everything you'll ever need to know is right there. And this game is 100% not the arcade experience that I expected it to be. I've never actually booted this ROM up before. This was one I just kind of picked at random. And, whoa, wow, this game's bad. Really awful. Don't play this one. Terrible. Just move on. Don't look at it. Play the arcade version. It's much better. The next game I played, though, was Fatal Fury CD, and I was in a beat-em-up mood. I wanted to try something a little bit different. I wanted to see how this sounded, and it sounds amazing. And that's true for Cadillacs and Dinosaurs as well. Like, the most impressive thing about it was the soundtrack and the voice work in it. It sounded great. Fatal Fury CD, though, the music is fantastic in it. The gameplay is spectacular, as you'd expect, like I said, but it just didn't have any issues. I didn't run into any problems whatsoever. It played great and sounded and looked wonderful. Let's hop over now to Nintendo's 16-bit offering, the Super Nintendo, and see if it can handle some Mode 7 graphics. The Super Nintendo is a spectacular machine, and honestly has been emulated for decades now. It's not something that should ever struggle, but still, it's a handheld device. I didn't know how strong the internals were going to be, so I wanted to check out some stuff. And the first thing I threw at it was F-Zero, because, I mean, it's all Mode 7 graphics. It's all just completely moving and changing and rotating. And I wanted to see how it would do. It was either this or Pilot Wings, and I really didn't feel like playing Pilot Wings this time. But you should go play it on the Nintendo Switch Online service, because Pilot Wings 64s are not... Anyway, F-Zero, great game, looks fantastic, no issues whatsoever, like we would expect. But the other one I wanted to try out was the big gun of the Super Nintendo, and that's Super Mario World. And no issues again. Everything looks, plays, and sounds fantastic, as you'd expect. I don't know why I was trying to trick the emulator on this one, because I kind of figured it was going to work perfectly, and it totally did. So, Super Nintendo, no issues whatsoever. Let's hop over now to another 16-bit console, the TurboGrafx 16. TurboGrafx 16 is something I don't have a lot of exposure to, but I know there are specific games that I really like. And up first is one of my favorites on the console, and that's Air Zonk. This is an amazing shmup. It is just so much fun, full of life, full of color. It's fast, there's huge boss battles, and it works perfectly. The Anbernic handled everything I threw at it. It didn't have any issues whatsoever. And this next one I tried out was Alien Crush, and this one I didn't really expect to throw any errors at the emulator. I just really wanted to play it because it's spectacular. And it is perfect. It runs perfectly. The biggest complaint I have about it is that I'm really bad at it, and that's not a fault of the emulator. That's on me. Let's go over now to another handheld, this one from Nintendo, and that is going to be the Game Boy Color. The Game Boy Color is emulated perfectly, as you would expect. Up first, I'm playing Shantae, and you know how I know it's emulated perfectly? Because this is just unbelievably difficult, because it's Shantae, and Shantae took no prisoners. But it looks good, and it plays good, and it sounds good, because it's way forward, and it's fantastic. The next one, also a way forward game. This is completely unintentional. I just wanted to play something weird, and that's WWF Betrayal. If you have never played this beat-em-up, you must, because you get to play as one of 4 WWF superstars, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, Triple H, or The Undertaker, and you get to beat the holy hell out of a referee with, like, a lead pipe. It's ridiculous. This game is silly and ridiculous, and I wish that the WWF did more games like this, or the WWE now did more games like this, because we need more games like this, because they need to not take themselves so seriously with their video games, because the 2K, you know what, I'm going to soapbox, we're going to get off of it now. Moving on now to another handheld, we are going to the NEOGEO Pocket Color. I love the NEOGEO Pocket Color. It's one of my all-time favorite handheld devices, and there were some absolutely spectacular games released for it, considering it had such an infinitely small library compared to things like the Game Boy and the DS. Everything I've played on it, I have enjoyed, at least in some way, shape, or form. And up first, we have Fantastic Night Dreams Cotton, an amazing shoot-'em-up in the Cotton series that I had never played before. I grabbed this one because I love the Cotton game, so I wanted to see how it played, and it's amazing. It's just like one of the Saturn Cotton games or the arcade Cotton games. It plays perfectly, just on a significantly simpler graphics scale. After that, I played Fatal Fury F-Contact, which is magnificent. All of the fighting games that I have played on the NEOGEO Pocket Color are amazing. They all control and look great. They have a distinct personality to them, which a lot of fighting games don't carry over. And they're just magnificent. They're just a ton of fun to play. None of these had any issues with emulation. I was able to pull off any move I wanted to with regularity as long as I knew what the combination was. And anything I wanted to do in Cotton, I did have an issue with. These are both fantastic. We're going to move on now to something that's a little bit more taxing on the system's resources, and that's going to be MAME emulation. And we're going to look at 3 different arcade games, something pretty old, something a little middling, and then something that is one of the most popular games of all time. One of my favorite little features on here, and forgive the camera work because I kind of forgot to record it, so this was a last-minute thing, but I really like the vertical arcade inclusion on this. By being able to flip the handheld on its side and hop into these classic vertical arcade games is just such a neat feature and something that I've never really experienced in an emulation handheld before, and I really appreciate it. Being able to play things like Gunbird here, which looks amazing and runs flawlessly well, is just a treat because it's just such a wonderful game. And then I was able to hop into something classic like Ms. Pac-Man, which also ran flawlessly well. I'm going to keep this one short because, like I said, the camera work sucks, but I also wanted to show off this amazing screen, which looks fantastic from any angle that I've had it at. This is a great little piece of hardware here. Fantastic little device. On MAME, I started with Congo Bongo, one of the classic Sega arcade games, and I'm awful at this game in arcades, and true to form, I'm awful at it on emulation as well, but it's just a charming game where you're playing as kind of like a Dr. Livingston explorer trying to go through the jungle, and a monkey sets your tent on fire, and you have to go after him to try to complete the level, and I wasn't able to complete the first level, which is a little disappointing, but it's playing perfectly. After that, I jumped over to the arcade version of Gunsmoke, which I have never actually played before. I love the NES version of this game, but this is something that released in the mid-'80s, and it wasn't something I had ever actually put any quarters into. I've never actually seen the arcade machine. And this is a lot of fun. It plays just like the NES version, just looks significantly better and sounds significantly better. But the one I was really curious to see how it played, and something that I figured was going to put a lot of kind of stress on the system, but it just ran perfectly, was X-Men. One of my favorite arcade games of all time, and one of the most popular arcade games of all time. I didn't have any issues playing this. I was able to get through the first level using Nightcrawler and just had so much fun playing it. It was a flawless gameplay experience, and I'm really, really happy about that. But now that we're through MAME, we're getting into the more modern consoles. One's modern, they're 20 years old at this point, but they're consoles that are a little bit more advanced as opposed to things like the 16-bit and 8-bit consoles. So we're going to hop over now to the PlayStation 1, and I'm playing one of my favorite RPGs and one of my favorite action games of all time. On the PlayStation 1, I started with Suikoden, which is from my favorite RPG series of all time, and I just wanted to see how this sounded, mainly, because the soundtrack in Suikoden is spectacular, and it just sounds amazing. The gameplay is kind of flawless. It runs perfectly. There's no issues encountered there, and I didn't expect there to be any issues with the gameplay for Suikoden, just because, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's kind of a basic game as far as gameplay goes, but I wanted to make sure the sound was there, and the soundtrack is picture perfect on the Anbernic, no issues whatsoever. The next game I played on the PS1 was The Misadventures of Tronbon, which is not only unbelievably expensive in the real world, it's also a little bit more advanced in Suikoden with full 3D graphics and actually like rotations of the camera and things like that. So I wanted to see how this played. And one of the things I forgot is that it actually has a really good soundtrack and digitized voice work in it as well. And there were no issues encountered there either. Everything was just playing perfectly well, looked and sounded fantastic, and was just really a good experience overall. Now, everything so far has been pretty much picture perfect. I haven't really had any major issues whatsoever. That changes now. This is where we're hopping over to the N64. The N64 seems to be a tale of two emulators, where we have things like F-Zero, which runs unbelievably well. Like, I was having a hard time telling that this was an emulator. There's definitely some things where you can tell it's not original hardware, but for the most part, this was running nearly flawlessly. The sound was great, the action was good, didn't have any noticeable slowdown, and the graphics looked fine. And then we get to things like Conker's Bad Fur Day, where no transparencies are being drawn. The music is choppy. It's just an ugly interrupt after an ugly interrupt, and it just couldn't be played. It was an unplayable experience, putting something like Conker's Bad Fur Day up, which, I mean, is a fairly intensive game, and Rare are wizards, and they did incredible things with the N64, but it just didn't work. But then I go over to something like Majora's Mask, and it's kind of a mix of the two. There's certain things that aren't working. There's flickering graphics. There's an entire cutscene that's just blacked out. I don't remember that happening in the original. But then for the rest of it, it's actually pretty competent. There's definitely some issues there. The sound isn't quite right, and the controls are a little bit slow, but overall, it's fairly good. I would say for the most part with N64, it's about a 50-50 shot of whether it's going to be an acceptable gameplay experience from what I've seen. I would probably avoid N64 emulation from a stock setup from what is originally on the hardware here, but there are options with other OSs that you can install, and one is called Gelos, which is a just enough Linux operating system that actually kind of puts more optimization towards the emulators and allows them to run better, and that's going to be something we explore in a future video. But out of the box, if you're just looking to play this from go, N64 isn't the best emulation experience. Much like the N64, the Saturn was a very mixed bag as well, but more positive than the N64 experience was, which I didn't expect in the slightest. Emulation's a little bit slow with the Saturn. Things move kind of like 3/4, almost like 7/8 pace, where everything just feels a little bit slower than it should, but for the most part, you can play. I got into Nights into Dreams and had no issues. It was actually a really fun gameplay experience. There was a little bit of stuttering here and there with the music, but for the most part, I didn't run into any problems. Graphically, it looked fine, and it controlled beautifully well on this system. When I got into Daytona USA, however, the wheels, pardon the pun, completely fell off. Everything stuttered, everything paused, the music was jumping all over the place, you couldn't see the menus. It was just an impossible navigation experience, and it was a horrible, horrible emulation for this game, which is really unfortunate because Daytona USA is spectacular. But then I did things like Street Fighter the Movie and Golden Axe the Duel, and they were great, if a little bit slow. So it's kind of a mixed bag again. It's definitely a more positive experience than what I had on the N64, and I would say that you're actually probably okay to emulate stuff for the Saturn on this console, because, I mean, if you have something that can even run 3/4 of the level of what the Saturn is capable of, then you're probably in good hands. Just understand that you're going to have to accept some downgrades in quality as you're doing so, but still, this is a pretty impressive experience right out of the box. I should note, however, that from jump, you do not have Saturn available in your list of games. You actually have to go into a menu on the top right button next to the screen and enable the Saturn from your games list. Once you do that, you'll be able to get into game. I love the Game Boy Advance, one of the best consoles of all time, and there was such a huge library on it that I wanted to really pick some weird games to try out here, and I don't think it gets any weirder than Go-Go Beckham Adventure on Soccer Island. This is, like, okay, if you don't know Mr. Posh Spice, David Beckham is one of the... Sorry. That's okay. If you... Okay, that's all staying in. If you don't know David Beckham, he's one of the greatest footballers of all time, soccer players for us here in the States. He's a legend. He's an absolute legend in the sport, and for him to get one of the cutest video games I've legit ever played is a little out there. But the game's just a ton of fun. It's an adventure game. It's an adventure platformer, and you use a soccer ball to unlock gates, to score goals, to collect coins, to defeat enemies. It's adorable. If you haven't played this one, I strongly urge you to do so because it's ridiculously fun. It's so much better than it has any right to be, and it's just a magnificently wonderful game. It's truly enjoyable. The next one is from Rare, and it is Banjo Pilot. And this game is ridiculous. I don't think the Game Boy Advance should play something that looks this good and is this advanced graphically so well, because I've played some other 3D racers on the Game Boy Advance, and they are just garbage. But this one, I mean, it's rare. They're working magic no matter what they do. But I love this game. Tons of fun. Look and sound fantastic. Play perfectly. Game Boy Advance emulation, no surprise, is done flawlessly well. We are on now to something that also didn't work so well, kind of like the N64, but is at least a little bit more enjoyable than those were, and that is the Nintendo DS. Starting on the Nintendo DS, one of the things I want to point out real quick before I get into the game here, when you are using the Anbernic to emulate the Nintendo DS screens, it's really nice on the TV because you can just pull the L2 trigger and it actually will cycle in between the different screens, and you can actually emulate it so rather than being side by side, they can be top to bottom, which is, you know, exactly how an NDS works, which is what you want it to do. And once I figured that out, I actually had a lot more fun with this. But the main issue with the Nintendo DS isn't so much the gameplay. The actual gameplay itself was fine. It's the sound. The sound is super choppy in both of the NDS games that I tried out. First was Thor God of Thunder, which is from Way Forward, which is an absolutely magnificent licensed title. If you've never played it, please do. It's a wonderful kind of side-scrolling 2D platformer starring Thor from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It plays brilliantly well. It's just the sound is super choppy and is really distracting. But if you drop the volume down, no issues encountered whatsoever. The next one is a super weird game and something that I'm a big fan of, and that's Little Red Riding Hood's Zombie Barbecue. This one, if you have never played it, you're going to have to sell a kidney to get because it's incredibly expensive, but it's a ton of fun to play. You use the touchscreen to fire your weapons and to move your character around, and you take care of the zombies that are coming towards you. As I discovered tonight, this is actually made by the guy who created Plants vs. Zombies, so pretty good pedigree there. I really enjoy this game, but much like Thor God of Thunder, the biggest issue here is that the sound is just terrible. But again, you drop the sound down, no issues whatsoever with gameplay. It's emulating sound poorly, which I find kind of curious, but that's neither here nor there. Gameplay is fine, sound is terrible. Let's move on now to the final console I tested on this machine, and that is the Sega Dreamcast, which I fully expected to perform like the Nintendo 64.
Battle for survival begins.
Finally, we come to the Sega Dreamcast, which I have had nightmares emulating in the past, and given my experience on the N64 and the NDS, I fully anticipated to not work. And I am so happy to report that the two games I tested, now granted this is not an extensive test whatsoever, but the two games I tested I have tried to emulate on other devices and have had issues with, and I had zero problems with the emulation. Up first is my favorite fighting game of all time, and that is Marvel vs. Capcom 2. This game runs terribly on my Super Console X Pro, and I expected that to happen here, but the Anbernic not only made it emulate perfectly, it was a smooth playing game with no issues whatsoever. A little bit of sound jittering here and there, but nothing like I experienced on the NDS or the N64. Everything was honestly magnificent. It was just a super fun time playing it. It was nice to go back to this game. I haven't played it on a handheld ever, so that was a really new experience for me. Second was something that I expected to really throw problems at it, and that was Cannon Spike. If you have never played Cannon Spike, this is what really, God, I wish the Dreamcast had a second analog stick for, because it should be a twin-stick shooter, but it's not. It's an arena shooter where you get to control a particular character and you're fighting wave after wave of enemies, and then you fight a big boss character at the end. And it's something that I expected to not emulate well, because I've never really had success emulating this in the past. And I was so pleased to be able to hop in the game and not have any issues encountered whatsoever. Like, just out of the gate, boom, good to go. No problems at all. I'm really excited to get a little bit more in depth with my Dreamcast testing on this one, because I think there's opportunities for some issues to be found on games like Sonic Adventure, because I've had some issues there as well. But for Marvel vs. Capcom 2 and Cannon Spike to run as flawlessly as they do made me very encouraged and very happy. Now let's get back over the chair and I'll give you my final thoughts on the Anbernic RG 353P. Alright, so day later, I've been playing this thing pretty much nonstop, and I want to let you know my final thoughts on the Anbernic RG 353P. I'm going to be honest with you, this is a really impressive device. Like, Anbernic is kind of the top of the line thing for a portable emulation machine, and it is exactly what I wanted it to be. And I'm just kind of scratching the surface on the different things that are available. Like, all of the microcomputers are available on here that I could be able to run. I'm just really impressed with what it's able to do out of the box. Give this machine a shot, you're going to be really impressed with it. I know I am. There's going to be a link down in the description to Amazon if you want to check this one out. It's a really nice machine. I think it's a very, very clever device and something a lot of people should be giving a shot to. Till next time, play more games, stay square, and take care. I'll talk to you soon.